All right, so get ready, because today we are diving deep into a world that's, well, let's just say it's a little bit strange. We're going to be looking into the Science of Identity Foundation, and you might know them by a different name. They're sometimes called Czaitanii Mission. And at the center of it all is this guy, Chris Butler. But he goes by this really grand title, Jagad Guru Siddhaswarupananda Paramahamsa.
Yeah, it's definitely a name that you don't forget. And as we get into this movement and its leader, we're going to be going through a lot of different sources. Court documents, personal accounts from former members. We've got news articles, academic studies. We've even got some social media posts in the mix.
Wow, okay, so we've got a pretty big stack of stuff to work with. So what exactly are we hoping to find out in this deep dive?
Well, we're going to be exploring some serious allegations against the Science of Identity Foundation, accusations of cult-like practices, we've got some questionable financial dealings, and even connections to a pretty prominent figure in U.S. politics.
Okay, this already sounded pretty juicy. But before we get into all that, maybe we should take a step back. What exactly is the Science of Identity Foundation? Where did it come from?
Good point. It claims to be part of the Gaudiya Vaishnavism tradition. That's a branch of Hinduism focused on the worship of Krishna. To understand this tradition, we need to go back to this key event in its history, the Kheturi festival. It brought together a lot of different Gaudiya Vaishnava groups way back in the 17th century.
So this festival was a pretty big deal for Gaudiya Vaishnavism.
Absolutely. It was all about unity, and finding a shared sense of belonging within this tradition. Actually, one of our sources, Keeping Faith with Kheturi, really emphasizes this idea of community, this idea of finding refuge and support within the Vaishnava community.
That's interesting, because from what I've heard, the Science of Identity Foundation doesn't really have a reputation for being welcoming.
Yeah, that's one of the big things we'll be exploring. You have this warm and fuzzy ideal of community, but then you have these allegations about control and exploitation within the movement.
Okay, so we have this historical backdrop, Gaudiya Vaishnavism, we've got this emphasis on community. But how does Chris Butler fit into all of this?
Well, his path is, let's just say it's anything but traditional. He was born in the U.S. and he got into Eastern spirituality back in the 1960s. And eventually, he started his own group in Hawaii, and that group eventually became the Science of Identity Foundation.
And how did he go from Chris Butler to, well, that?
He just decided to call himself Jagad Guru Siddhaswarupananda Paramahamsa, and that really raised some eyebrows in traditional Gaudiya circles.
I can imagine. Why is that?
So in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, the title Jagad Guru is usually given to very revered figures, people acknowledged by the wider community. But Butler, well, he just took it upon himself.
So it's like he's claiming this really prestigious title without having the traditional backing. Kind of a red flag, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about as we go deeper. And adding to all this, Butler had a pretty rocky relationship with A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. He was the founder of ISKCON, another big Gaudiya Vaishnava organization. They had their issues, which, eventually led to them splitting.
Well, it seemed like Butler was kind of doing his own thing, not really sticking to tradition.
Exactly. And that independence seems to extend to how the Science of Identity Foundation works. So let's get into it. The allegations of cult-like practices within the movement.
Yeah, this is where things start to get a little unsettling.
You can say that again. We've got court documents, personal accounts, news reports, and they paint a very different picture of life inside the foundation than that nice image of a supportive community we were talking about earlier. Former members have said it was a really controlled environment where everything revolved around serving Butler.
Wow, okay, so what kind of control are we talking about?
Well, we've got accounts of devotees allegedly performing all kinds of tasks for Butler. Cooking, cleaning, driving him around. Some people even described followers competing to wear his old clothes or even eat his leftovers.
Wow, okay. That's a little intense. Definitely seems to clash with the idea of a healthy spiritual community. What else is there?
There are also claims that Butler required followers to undergo unnecessary medical treatments and follow really strict hygiene protocols.
Okay, so we've got control over their daily tasks, this devotion to Butler, and pressure regarding medical treatments and hygiene. Are we seeing a pattern here?
It's something worth paying attention to for sure. Throwing around the word cult can be tricky. It's a loaded term. But there are some common signs of a cult that we can look at. Things like a charismatic leader who has too much influence, isolation from the outside world, and the use of manipulation to control members.
Yeah, those characteristics do seem to fit with what we're learning about the Science of Identity Foundation. So are some of these things red flags?
Oh, absolutely. The level of devotion to Butler, the alleged control over people's lives, the reported isolation from family and friends, these are all things that should be looked into.
So we started with community and belonging, and now we're seeing these potential problems with control and harmful practices. It's a pretty big difference. But this story, it actually gets even more complicated when we start looking at their finances.
You're talking about those organizations and businesses that seem to be connected to the Science of Identity Foundation.
Exactly. We have Down to Earth, that vegetarian grocery chain,
hmm
and QNet, which is a global multi-level marketing company. They seem totally unrelated to a spiritual movement. So how are they connected to this story?
Well, let's start with Down to Earth. It's a Hawaii-based grocery chain, and it was partially funded by Wailana, and she just so happens to be Chris Butler's wife.
Wait, his wife? I thought he was supposed to be like a renunciate, like a sannyasin, like those traditional Gaudiya gurus.
You've hit on a big contradiction.
Mm.
Yeah, his marriage to Wailana definitely raised some eyebrows within the Gaudiya tradition. She's a pretty successful yoga entrepreneur herself. It's not really what you'd expect from a renunciate.
Yeah, not really. Okay, so we've got a link between the movement and Down to Earth through his wife. But what about QNet? That's a multi-level marketing company, which seems even further from a spiritual organization.
The link there is Joseph Bismarck. He's the co-founder of QNet, and he's alleged to be a follower of Butler. But QNet has come under fire. Some of its executives, including Bismarck, were even arrested on charges of fraud.
Whoa, fraud charges.
It was a big deal. Even the Supreme Court of India got involved. They were really scrutinizing QNet's financial practices, and they've been accused of operating like pyramid schemes.
So to be clear, we've got a grocery chain and a multi-level marketing company.
Hmm.
And they're both connected to the Science of Identity Foundation. What are we
Hmm.
supposed to make of these connections?
That's what we're trying to figure out. And things get even more complicated when you look at some leaked letters from the Science of Identity Foundation. These letters actually told followers to donate money because apparently the organization was running low on cash.
That's interesting. It seems like maybe they weren't as financially stable as they seemed.
Huh.
Could this be a sign of, like, financial mismanagement
Mm.
or even exploitation of members?
It's possible, and it's something we'll need to look into. You've got a secretive guru, these allegations of cult-like behavior, and now these financial irregularities. It's starting to feel like a puzzle that's missing some pieces.
A very interesting puzzle. And speaking of missing pieces, there's one more we need to add. And it involves someone you might recognize, Tulsi Gabbard.
Ah, yes, the former U.S. representative and presidential candidate. Her ties to the Science of Identity Foundation go way back.
She's been open about Chris Butler being her guru, but it turns out her family's involvement with the movement goes even further back. There's actually this document, Tulsi Gabbard 0001116.pdf, that tells us a lot about this.
Right. This document shows that Gabbard's family has been involved with this movement for decades. We're talking going back to when she was just a kid.
So it's more than just her personal spiritual journey. Her family's history is connected to this movement. And it's not just spiritual guidance either. There seem to be some financial ties, too.
You're talking about the campaign contributions she got from people linked to QNet and the Science of Identity Foundation.
Yeah, exactly. And there's more. She also employed people connected to the movement in her political campaigns.
So we've got financial connections and personnel connections between Gabbard, the Science of Identity Foundation, and QNet, which, remember, is a company with its own set of controversies. This is starting to feel like a big tangled web.
A web that we are definitely going to try to untangle in part 2 of this deep dive. We'll be looking at those inconsistencies we're seeing, both within the Science of Identity Foundation and in Chris Butler's life.
Yeah, and we'll take a closer look at Gabbard's ties to the movement and talk about what these connections might mean for her political career.
So stay tuned, everyone. This deep dive is just getting started. Welcome back, everyone, for part 2 of our deep dive into the Science of Identity Foundation.
Yeah, we've got a lot more to unpack.
Last time, we were talking about the roots of the Science of Identity Foundation in Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And we started looking at some pretty serious allegations against the movement, claims of cult-like behavior, financial irregularities, and even connections to a prominent political figure, Tulsi Gabbard.
Right, and at the center of all of this is this figure, Chris Butler, who calls himself Jagat Guru.
And that whole Jagat Guru thing is still bothering me. It just seems so different from that traditional Gaudiya Vaishnavism we talked about.
Yeah, you're right. And it's one of many inconsistencies we're finding with the Science of Identity Foundation and in Butler's life.
Okay, so let's talk about those inconsistencies. What stands out to you?
Well, one that's really obvious is the contrast between their message of peace and love, their devotion to Krishna, And those allegations of controlling behavior and exploitation.
Yeah, like they're preaching this philosophy of self-discovery and spiritual growth. But then we have these people saying that it's completely different, that their lives were micromanaged, their finances were controlled.
Right, exactly.
It's almost like they're putting up a front. And Butler himself seems to be really secretive.
That's another thing that's strange. He almost never gives interviews or makes public appearances. And he really controls the information that comes out of the movement. It makes it really hard to know what's really going on inside.
It really makes you wonder what he's hiding.
Right, like what's he so afraid of?
And then there's this thing where they say they're not a religion.
Oh yeah, that
They've
one.
got a guru, they have chants, rituals, but they say they're not a religion.
Butler says it's more of a science, like a way of understanding who you are, without any religious dogma.
But come on, that just doesn't seem right.
Right, some countries have actually recognized them as a religious organization.
So what's the deal?
It feels like a way to avoid scrutiny.
Yeah, it's like they want the benefits of being a religion without any of the downsides. And you know what else is a big contradiction? Butler's marriage.
Oh yeah, how could I forget?
How can he be a renunciate, a sannyasin, and still be married?
Mm.
And running businesses?
It really doesn't fit with that traditional understanding of sannyasa, does it? It makes you question if he's really living by what he preaches.
It definitely seems hypocritical.
Yeah.
And speaking of hypocrisy, let's talk about the money. Down to Earth and QNet.
Right, those two.
Down to Earth, that vegetarian grocery chain, was partially funded by his wife.
Mhm.
And then you've got QNet, which has faced all these legal problems.
Accusations of being a pyramid scheme.
Yeah, exactly. And those allegations make you wonder if the Science of Identity Foundation is benefiting from all of this.
Mm.
So we have these questionable businesses, we have allegations of cult-like control, and a guru who doesn't seem to follow his own teachings.
It's pretty disturbing when you put it all together.
It is.
And it really highlights the issue of power in these spiritual movements. When you have a charismatic leader like Butler, surrounded by all this secrecy, controlling everything, it can easily lead to abuse.
And that's even more worrying when you think about the influence they seem to have on Tulsi Gabbard.
It's definitely raised a lot of questions, especially given her political ambitions.
She's said that Butler is her guru. And we know from that document, Tulsi Gabbard 001166.pdf, that her family's been connected to the movement for a long time.
Since she was a kid, it's a deep connection.
And it's not just about spiritual stuff either. There are those financial ties and those personnel connections too.
She's received campaign money from people linked to both the Science of Identity Foundation and QNet. And she's had people from the movement working on her campaigns.
So it makes you wonder, is there something more going on here? Is she being influenced by Butler and his followers?
It's tough to say for sure, but it's definitely something voters should think about.
Especially considering all the problems with Butler and the Science and Identity Foundation. And it becomes even more important when you look at some of Gabbard's political stances.
You're talking about her connections to Hindu nationalist groups.
Yeah, that's right. She's been a big supporter of the Overseas Friends of BJP, the OFBJP.
That's the U.S. branch of India's ruling party, the BJP.
And the BJP has been accused of promoting a Hindu nationalist agenda.
One that really marginalizes religious minorities in India.
Exactly.
And her close ties to OFBJP leaders have made some people worried.
And she's defended the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, quite a bit.
He's been criticized for how he's handled religious tensions and human rights in India.
And that stance, well, it lines up with Butler and the Science of Identity Foundation.
They've also expressed support for Hindu nationalism.
So it's like her religious beliefs and political views are kind of mixing together here. She's aligning herself with a movement that's accused of being a cult, and a political party accused of promoting Hindu supremacy.
It's a worrying combination. And it makes it even more important to figure out how much influence the Science of Identity Foundation has on her political decisions.
So it's like we're seeing this pattern here, this movement that claims to be about love and enlightenment, but it's tangled up in all this questionable stuff.
Alleged cult practices, financial irregularities, connections to a controversial political party.
It's complicated.
It is. And in the next part, we're going to look at how the Science of Identity Foundation actually works. We'll hear from former members about what life was like inside.
Yeah, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of it all. And we'll look at how this movement is spreading, its global reach, and its impact on politics and society.
So stick around, everyone. This deep dive is about to get even more interesting.
Right, so welcome back to our final part of this deep dive into the Science of Identity Foundation.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it?
It really has. We've gone through a lot of information, explored some really serious claims, And we've started to see the connections that this movement has. We've talked about the inconsistencies in their message of peace and love, and those accusations of controlling behavior, the secrecy around Chris Butler, those financial links with Down to Earth and QNet, and of course, Tulsi Gabbard's long relationship with the movement, which, raises even more questions.
And we've only just scratched the surface.
Exactly. So in this last part, I really want to try to understand what life is actually like inside the Science of Identity Foundation. What do we know about how they operate?
Well, based on what former members have said, it seems to be very structured. There's a lot of discipline and a big focus on Butler's teachings and rules.
So it's not just like going to a service every week. This is their whole life.
Yeah, pretty much. We have this one former member, and their story is in Fear and Butler's Cult.pdf. They had to sign this statement, basically saying that they were part of the movement voluntarily and that they were happy to do whatever tasks they were given.
Wait, hold on. Why would they need a statement like that if it was really voluntary?
It does make you wonder, doesn't it? It could mean that there was some pressure to conform.
And that pressure seems to be there with the finances too, right? Those leaked letters we talked about where they were asking followers to donate money.
Right, and we've heard from former members that there was a lot of expectation around giving money. There's this example in Our Czaitanii mission, Polish Hive 000155.pdf. This former member was kicked out after they lost their job and had to go back home.
So they were basically kicked out because they couldn't give enough money.
It looks like it. It shows that maybe the Science of Identity Foundation cares more about its own finances than its members.
This is getting pretty disturbing. We've got these allegations of cult-like behavior, the pressure to give money, the secrecy. It just feels like something isn't right.
Yeah, I get it. But we do have to remember that these are just accusations. We haven't heard from Butler himself. And the Science of Identity Foundation has denied a lot of these claims.
That's true. There are always multiple sides. But there are so many of these claims, and they come from so many different sources and over such a long time.
You're right, it's definitely a pattern. We've seen this kind of thing in other groups that have been accused of harmful things. You have a charismatic leader, a tightly controlled environment, a focus on money. It's a recipe for problems.
And this isn't just a small group either. The Science of Identity Foundation is all over the world.
Yeah, they've got centers everywhere and lots of followers. And they use media and technology really well, like Wailana's yoga platform.
Oh, right, those yoga videos.
They've been really successful in spreading their message.
So it's more than just yoga.
It's a way to get people interested in their philosophy. They start with something that seems harmless, like physical and mental well-being, and then they slowly introduce their beliefs.
It's pretty clever. Makes you wonder how much influence they really have, especially with Tulsi Gabbard and the concerns about political influence.
And then there's QNet, which suggests they might have financial influence too. It's hard to say how far it goes.
So as we wrap this up, what are the big things we've learned? What should our listeners take away from all of this?
I think the most important thing is to be critical, especially when you come across an organization that makes big promises.
Don't believe everything you hear.
Do your own research, ask questions, look at different perspectives.
And trust your instincts.
If something feels wrong, it probably is.
That's great advice. And thank you so much for taking us on this deep dive into the Science of Identity Foundation.
It was my pleasure. And remember, this is just the start. We should all keep learning about this movement and what it means.
Absolutely. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay skeptical. We'll see you next time.